What happens when silence speaks louder than sirens? In Hollow Creek, a simple 5-mile-over speeding stop spirals into a storm no one saw coming. A black woman, calm and unshaken, turns out to be more than just another driver. She's the reckoning. Secrets buried for years rise to the surface. Stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video for more powerful stories. The road that night stretched long and empty, a thin ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through miles of pine forest. It was nearly 10 o'clock, the last breath of daylight gone, leaving Hollow Creek wrapped in shadow. Streetlights were sparse out here. The only illumination came from Camille Hart's headlights as they swept across the faded road signs, the numbers on them barely visible under layers of dust. Camille drove with the kind of steady control that came naturally to her, eyes forward, mind sharpened, her thoughts circling around the work that had brought her here. She wasn't speeding, not in any meaningful sense. Her dashboard needle ticked at 45 in a 40 zone. A minor slip, the kind of thing most officers would wave off. But not here. Not in Hollow Creek. The sudden flash of red and blue in her rearview mirror didn't surprise her, though it should have startled anyone else. She felt it in her bones, the inevitability of it. Two vehicles had been parked off the road for nearly half a mile, silhouettes barely visible under the moonlight. When the cruiser rolled up behind her, siren yelping once like a warning bark, Camille slowed her car and pulled onto the gravel shoulder. Dust rose in slow spirals as her tires crunched to a halt. Deputy Mark Ellison stepped out first. Young, broad-shouldered, and arrogant, he walked with the confidence of someone who believed the badge made him untouchable. Behind him, Sheriff Clayton Briggs emerged, heavier, older, but carrying himself with the air of a man who thought the county line was his kingdom. Camille's gaze flicked to her rearview mirror, watching them approach. She rested her hands lightly on the steering wheel, posture composed, her breathing slow. Ellison tapped the glass of her driver's side window, the smirk already etched onto his face. "Evening, ma'am. You know why I pulled you over?" Camille rolled the window down halfway, her expression calm. "No, deputy. Would you like to tell me?" 45 and a 40. Out-of-state plates. Kinda suspicious, don't you think? His voice carried the sharpness of someone trying too hard to sound authoritative. Sheriff Briggs leaned closer on the passenger side, his shadow filling the window. "License and registration. Let's see if you even belong here." Camille reached slowly toward the glove compartment, but before her hand touched it, Ellison barked, "Keep your hands where I can see 'em." His tone shifted from smug to sharp, and for a moment the night air froze around them. Camille lifted her hands back to the wheel, unbothered. She didn't argue. She didn't flinch. "My license and registration are in the glove compartment," she said softly, her voice even. "You never asked before you cuffed me." That last part made Ellison's jaw tighten. He didn't like being reminded of procedure, especially not by someone he already considered beneath him. With unnecessary force, he yanked her door open, his hand gripping her arm as though she'd tried to run. The cold metal of the cuffs clicked around her wrists, sharp against her skin. The motion was rough, deliberate, a small performance for the sheriff standing a few steps away. "Well, well," Briggs muttered, as Camille stepped out of the car. "Looks like we've got ourselves a smart mouth." His tone carried amusement, but his eyes studied her like a predator measuring prey. The gas station attendant across the street, leaning against the pump island, chuckled under his breath. To them, it was all a show. A black woman stopped on a quiet county highway, mocked, humiliated, treated as guilty before being asked a single question. Ellison tugged Camille toward the cruiser, exaggerating the pull of her cuffed wrists. "You'd think folks driving from D.C. would know better," he sneered. This is... You don't roll through Hollow Creek like you own it. Camille's eyes met his in the side mirror as he shoved her into the back seat. Her gaze was steady, unblinking, as if she were looking straight through him. For a flicker of a second, his grin faltered. Something about her composure unsettled him. How she wasn't resisting, wasn't begging, wasn't even visibly angry. She just was, silent, watching. And that silence unnerved him more than shouting ever could. The sheriff pulled her glove compartment open himself, fishing out her license and registration. His face hardened when he read it aloud. Camille Hart, D.C. address. Well, ain't that something? Ellison frowned. D.C.? What's a city slicker like you doing speeding through our county? Camille finally spoke again, her voice measured, calm as the night air around them. Passing through. Is that a problem? For a moment, the sheriff squirmed under her gaze. It was soft, almost polite, yet it cut deep. He closed the glove box with more force than necessary, muttering under his breath. Just process her, Mark. Another outsider thinking they can fly through Evergreen County without consequence. 5 miles over the limit. A laughable charge, yet enough to justify their escalation. And in Hollow Creek, escalation was the rule. As the cruiser pulled away with Camille in the back seat, the pine forest swallowed the road again, shadows pressing close on either side. She sat quietly, her wrists bound, her mind sharp. Every detail, every word, every glance, every unnecessary tug of the cuffs, she recorded in silence. The deputies thought they'd caught a nameless driver, an easy target. But Camille Hart wasn't nameless, and she wasn't helpless. She was the storm building just beyond their horizon. At the Hollow Creek station, her arrival was met with laughter and curiosity. Deputies leaned against door frames, smirking as Ellison paraded her through booking. The fingerprint ink pressed dark against her fingertips. The camera flashed, capturing her in the orange jumpsuit they shoved into her hands. She changed without a word, folding her own clothes neatly as though she were unpacking in a hotel room. You'll see the judge in the morning, one deputy mumbled, avoiding her eyes. Understood, she said simply, and then sat on the cell bench, hands folded, eyes closed. She did not move again that night. But inside, her silence was not fear. It was patience. And in that patience lived a storm waiting for the right moment to break. The clank of the cell door echoed down the narrow corridor like the sound of iron sealing fate. The Hollow Creek station was small, no more than 4 holding cells, a booking desk, and a hallway that smelled of old coffee, bleach, and sweat. It was nearly 11 o'clock now, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead with a faint hum that made the silence between words even sharper. Camille Hart sat on the cold metal bench, her wrists still cuffed, though she had made no move to resist. Deputy Mark Ellison leaned against the bars, arms crossed, smirk still glued to his face, as though it was part of his uniform. "Not gonna say much, are you?" he taunted, his voice carrying a smug drawl. He expected her to lash out, to argue, to demand answers. Most people did by now, especially the ones dragged in for nothing more than a minor stop. But Camille remained still, eyes half closed, breathing even. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was a presence, a calm that filled the cramped space so completely, it made Ellison shift his weight without realizing it. He had been trained to control suspects through intimidation, through raising his voice, through force if necessary. But this woman, this stranger from D.C., she didn't respond to the script. She didn't flinch when he cuffed her too tightly, didn't complain when they laughed at her, didn't beg when the jumpsuit was tossed her way. She simply moved like she had chosen every step long before he ordered it. "Maybe she thinks she's too good to talk to us," Sheriff Clayton Briggs muttered from his office doorway, watching her through the glass. His bulk filled the frame, his belt buckle gleaming under the light. "City types always got some attitude. Don't worry, Mark. By morning, she'll be crying like the rest of 'em." But even Briggs, for all his bluster, lingered a little longer than usual before heading back inside. There was something in the way Camille sat, straight-backed, hands folded neatly on her lap, that unsettled him. Defendants weren't supposed to look like that. They were supposed to shrink, to sag under the weight of humiliation. She looked as though she was waiting for a meeting, calm, collected, utterly unshaken. The minutes dragged, then turned into hours. Midnight passed. Deputies came and went, tossing casual glances her way, whispering to each other when they thought she couldn't hear. Some laughed. Others frowned, unsettled by her quiet. Ellison returned more than once, pacing outside her cell, tapping the bars with his flashlight. "You know you're not making this easier on yourself, right?" he said finally, breaking the silence. "Judge don't like smart mouths. Better to come clean now. Tell us why you were in such a hurry." Camille opened her eyes slowly. Her gaze met his, steady and sharp, cutting through the dim light. Her voice, when it came, was calm and measured. So soft, it made him lean closer just to catch it. "You never asked for my documents before you cuffed me. 7 words. That was all." But in that moment, Ellison's smirk faltered. He hadn't expected her to speak at all, and certainly not with that quiet certainty. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't pleading. She was simply telling the truth, stripped of fear or performance. Ellison cleared his throat, trying to recover. "Don't play games with me. We had cause." Camille tilted her head slightly, as if studying him. "For 5 miles over the limit?" The question hung in the air like smoke, curling around him, choking his false confidence. He shifted, tapped the flashlight again, then muttered something under his breath before walking away. But the words stayed with him, echoing long after he left the corridor. "You never asked for my documents before you cuffed me." Hours passed in silence. Camille barely moved, conserving her strength, her mind working with quiet precision. Every laugh, every whisper, every careless word thrown her way, she catalogued like evidence. To the deputies, she looked passive, defeated even. But inside, she was writing the story they didn't yet know they were part of. By 2 a.m, the station had grown quieter. The hum of the lights and the distant shuffle of papers were the only sounds. Sheriff Briggs emerged from his office again, yawning, scratching at his beard. He stopped in front of Camille's cell, peering at her like she was some kind of puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "You're a strange one," he muttered. "Most folks, they start hollerin' by now, callin' for lawyers, threatenin' lawsuits. But you," he squinted, shaking his head, "you just sit there like you're waitin' for something." Camille didn't reply. She didn't even open her eyes. Her stillness was her answer, and it unsettled him more than anything she could have said. Briggs lingered another moment, then stomped off, muttering about uppity outsiders under his breath. In truth, Camille was waiting. Not for mercy, not for some miraculous turn of fate, but for morning. She knew the courtroom would be the stage where silence would become thunder. The booking, the cuffs, the mocking laughter, all of it was just the prologue. The real reckoning would begin when she spoke her name. But for now, silence was her weapon. Silence magnified the cracks in their confidence. Silence forced them to look at her and wonder why she wasn't breaking like the others. In that silence, Ellison's smirk wavered. Briggs's bluster faltered, and even the younger deputies avoided her eyes. By the time the clock struck 6, the first rays of dawn creeping through the blinds, Camille had not spoken again. Not a complaint, not a protest. Nothing but the single, undeniable truth she had already given them. She sat in her cell, as though she belonged there by choice. Her calm composure a quiet storm waiting for the moment it would break. What none of them knew, not Ellison with his arrogance, not Briggs with his false authority, was that Camille's silence was not submission. It was strategy. And when the judge finally called her name, when the courtroom doors opened, that silence would transform into the kind of truth that could shatter an entire county. The night in Hollow Creek stretched on, each hour dragging like iron chains across the floor. By the time the clock over the booking desk read 3 in the morning, Camille Hart had already become an object of fascination inside the station. Her silence had outlasted their jokes. Her stillness unsettled their swagger. Yet, in the shallow world of men who thought a badge excused cruelty, the game was only beginning. They brought her to the booking desk under the hum of yellowed fluorescent lights, Deputy Mark Ellison gripping her arm with more force than necessary. He didn't need to drag her. She walked willingly, steady, calm, but the tug was part of the theater. To him, control wasn't enough. He needed the performance of control. Sheriff Clayton Briggs leaned against the wall, arms folded, his heavy frame casting a shadow across the checkered linoleum floor. "Stand there!" Ellison barked, spinning Camille toward the camera. She did, without hesitation, folding her hands loosely in front of her. The camera flash cracked once, the sharp white light cutting across her composed face. In the photo, there was no fear, no pleading expression, only calm authority, a detail none of them noticed, but one that would matter later. The fingerprint ink was cold against her skin, black ridges pressed into cards with practiced indifference. Ellison smirked at her hands as he wiped them roughly with a rag. "Gotta say, lady, you're making this real easy. Don't usually get folks so quiet." The deputies watching from the hall chuckled under their breath. One whispered, "She thinks she's better than us." Another added, "Won't last long when the judge sees her." Their voices were meant for each other, but Camille heard every word. She didn't flinch. Instead, she folded her clothes neatly when they handed her the orange jumpsuit, setting each piece on the bench as if she were unpacking in a hotel room. Her folded blouse, her slacks, even her shoes lined up perfectly, an order that mocked the chaos around her. When she emerged in the prison uniform, Ellison laughed. "Look at that. Fits like a glove." Briggs chuckled too, but his eyes flickered with something else, a hesitation, a discomfort he would never admit. For reasons he couldn't name, the sight of her in that jumpsuit didn't feel like victory. It felt like a warning. Camille walked past them, the cuffs removed now, her wrists bearing faint red marks. They placed her in a cell, the door clanging shut with the sound of finality. The deputies lingered, whispering to one another, their laughter bouncing against the concrete walls. Camille sat down on the metal bench, crossed one ankle over the other, and closed her eyes. Her hands rested in her lap, her breathing slow, as though she were meditating in a quiet room instead of locked in a cage. The silence thickened. At first, the deputies found it amusing. One mimicked her posture, folding his hands dramatically and closing his eyes until the others laughed. Another tapped the bars with his flashlight and said, "Meditating your way out of this one." But their jokes fell flat against her stillness. No reaction, no anger, no plea, just silence, heavy, deliberate, powerful. By 4 o'clock, the station had grown quieter. The coffee pot burbled in the corner, its burnt smell filling the air. The younger deputies drifted to their desks, scrolling through phones, filling out half-hearted reports. But every so often, their eyes flicked back to the cell, to the woman who sat motionless as if time itself bent around her. They didn't understand it, couldn't place the strange weight of her calm. She wasn't behaving like a defendant. She was behaving like someone waiting for others to reveal themselves. Sheriff Briggs re-emerged from his office, boots striking the floor with slow, deliberate thuds. He stopped in front of her cell, staring through the bars. "You think you're making a point, don't you?" His voice was low, gravelly, threaded with irritation. "You sit there quiet, folding your clothes all neat, staring off like none of this touches you. But this is Hollow Creek, my county. You're not in control here." Camille opened her eyes, met his gaze, and then closed them again. Nothing more. Briggs bristled. He wanted a reaction, needed it, but she gave him nothing. He muttered a curse under his breath and turned away, his boots striking harder against the floor as he stormed back into his office. Ellison watched the exchange with unease. For the first time since the arrest, doubt pricked at the edge of his mind. He replayed her words from earlier. "You never asked for my documents before you cuffed me." And though he tried to bury it beneath bravado, it lingered like a splinter. He shook it off, muttering to the deputy beside him, "She'll crack by morning. They always do." But his voice lacked the confidence it carried before. Morning crept in slowly, the first gray light of dawn seeping through the blinds. Camille hadn't moved. She hadn't spoken. She hadn't given them anything. Yet somehow, in her silence, she had given them everything. The reflection of their own cruelty. The proof of their smallness. Every joke they made echoed back hollow. Every whisper seemed thinner against her composure. She had turned their mockery into background noise, insignificant compared to her stillness. At 6 o'clock, a deputy walked by her cell with a clipboard. He paused, staring at her for a long moment before moving on. Later, in the break room, he muttered to another, "She's not like the others. Feels like she's waiting on something." And she was. Camille Hart knew humiliation when she saw it. She had studied it in reports, heard it in testimonies, watched it in body cam footage, where men like Briggs and Ellison laughed while binding wrists that had done nothing wrong. But humiliation only worked when the target accepted it. She hadn't. She refused to. Instead, she reclaimed it, folded it neatly like her clothes, set it aside, and sat taller in its presence. By the time the deputies prepared to transport her to court, the balance of power inside the station had shifted in ways none of them could name. They thought they were the ones humiliating her. In truth, her silence had stripped their laughter of power, leaving them with nothing but the sound of their own nervous voices bouncing back off the concrete walls. Camille rose from the bench when they came for her, smoothing the orange fabric with deliberate calm. Her wrists were free now, but even if they weren't, she would have carried herself the same way. Straight-backed, composed, ready. She didn't look like a defendant walking toward judgment. She looked like a judge herself, heading into a courtroom none of them were ready to face. And as the morning light poured through the barred windows, Hollow Creek didn't yet know that its quiet storm was only beginning. The morning sun rose over Hollow Creek like a reluctant witness, pale and slow, dragging its light across the rooftops of the small town. By 8 o'clock, the courthouse clock was already striking, its bell carrying across the square, calling the town to its daily rituals of disputes and judgments. The Hollow Creek County Courthouse stood at the center of it all, a brick building older than memory, its windows fogged with condensation, its wooden steps worn smooth by decades of weary feet. Inside, the air carried the faint smell of stale coffee, paper, and dust polished thin by time. Camille Hart was led into the building just after 9, her wrists uncuffed, but her steps steady, measured. The deputies who escorted her tried to hurry her along, but Camille walked at her own pace, eyes moving not in fear, but in quiet observation. The hallways whispered with history, the portraits of past judges staring down from crooked frames, the faded flags drooping in corners, the seal above the main courtroom door cracked just enough to betray the building's age. Every detail entered her mind like evidence, the environment of power, and the cracks already showing in its foundations. Judge Martin Harlow had presided in that courthouse for nearly 2 decades. He was a tall man, gray-haired, with deep lines carved into his face from years of squinting at arguments and balancing patience with sternness. He had seen all manner of defendants pass before him, drunks pulled from bar fights, farmers feuding over fences, drivers speeding through county roads. Rarely, however, had he seen someone like her, a woman standing tall, silent, and oddly unshaken after a night in the Hollow Creek jail. He barely looked up when she entered, assuming, as he always did, that another easy morning case would pass through his docket without challenge. The benches in the courtroom creaked under the shifting weight of deputies who had come to watch. Sheriff Clayton Briggs sat in the back row, his wide frame sprawled like he owned the wooden bench itself. His hat rested on his knee, his lips curled in a smirk that suggested he had already written the end of this story. Beside him, Deputy Mark Ellison leaned forward, whispering something low. Briggs chuckled, and Ellison grinned like a boy in on a secret. To them, this was still their stage, still their county, still their law. But not everyone in the room shared their certainty. Near the front, scribbling in a notepad, sat Nora Vega, reporter for the Hollow Creek Ledger. Nora was young but sharp, with a trench coat draped over her shoulders and a pen that moved quickly across the page. She had come expecting another dull case, a minor infraction dressed up as failure to comply, and obstruction, charges the sheriff's office often stacked when someone dared to question their authority. But when Camille was led into the courtroom, Nora hesitated. Something in the woman's bearing, in the way she carried herself after a night in a cell, told her this wasn't routine. She lingered when she might have left, watching, listening, her instincts sparking. The bailiff called the room to order, his voice echoing against the high wooden beams. Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Martin Harlow presiding. Harlow entered from the side door, robes flowing, his face as tired as the building itself. He adjusted his glasses, glanced at the docket, and spoke with practiced monotony. Next case. Defendant, step forward. Camille moved with deliberate calm, her chin lifted, her gaze steady as she walked toward the defense table. The deputies muttered behind her, a ripple of whispers laced with laughter. Ellison leaned toward Briggs. "She didn't even ask for a lawyer," he whispered, his voice just loud enough to carry. "Probably thinks it'll all disappear." Briggs snorted in amusement. "They always think they know the law until they don't." Their words drew a faint smirk from 1 or 2 deputies nearby, but Nora Vega caught them, scribbling notes in the margin of her pad. She had covered Hollow Creek long enough to know those whispers weren't just careless. They were patterns. Patterns of arrogance, of certainty, of men who thought they controlled the ending before the story began. Judge Harlow looked down at Camille with a glance that was almost dismissive. "Name for the record." "Camille Hart," she said, her voice clear and even. The sound cut through the murmurs in the courtroom like a thread of steel. "Charged with speeding, failure to comply, and obstruction," the judge continued, scanning the page. "How do you plead?" The room leaned forward. The deputies smirked. Sheriff Briggs tapped his hat against his knee like a drumbeat. They expected silence, maybe a stammer, maybe a hurried, "not guilty." But Camille didn't answer right away. Instead, she let her eyes move across the room, sweeping slowly from the judge to the deputies in the back row, then to Nora Vega in the front. She studied them, weighed them, measured them, her silence drawing the moment taut. For a heartbeat, the whole courtroom seemed to pause, as though even the air held its breath. "Before I plead," she said at last, her tone calm but commanding, "I would like to formally identify myself." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Sheriff Briggs leaned back, folding his arms, his smirk widening. "Ah, here we go," Ellison whispered, his grin sharp, expecting some empty excuse, some desperate attempt at leverage. Judge Harlow raised an eyebrow, curious but cautious. "Proceed," he said, his voice carrying the faintest edge of impatience. Camille reached into the property bag the bailiff had set on the table. From it, she drew a slim leather case, snapping it open with precise, deliberate movement. Between two fingers, she held up a badge that gleamed under the dim courtroom light. "Special Agent Camille Hart," she said clearly, her voice steady as stone. "Federal Civil Rights Division, Department of Justice." The silence that followed felt like thunder stolen from the sky. Every deputy froze. Ellison's grin vanished. Briggs shifted in his seat, the smirk slipping from his face for the first time. Judge Harlow's eyes, dull moments before, snapped up with sudden focus. Even Nora Vega's pen paused mid-sentence. The courtroom had changed in an instant. What had begun as routine humiliation had just become something else entirely. Camille placed the badge on the table with a calm finality. "I was working undercover," she continued, "documenting a pattern of unlawful arrests in this jurisdiction." The storm that had been brewing silently through the night was about to break. The badge gleamed under the dull courtroom light, its polished surface throwing back a glint that landed like a blade across the room. For a moment, no one moved. The silence was thick enough to choke on. The deputies who had been laughing in the back row sat frozen, their smirks curdling into half-formed expressions of disbelief. Sheriff Clayton Briggs leaned forward, his bulk suddenly smaller against the hard wooden bench. Deputy Mark Ellison's mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Judge Martin Harlow, who had seen nearly 20 years of defendants shuffle through his court with downcast eyes, finally lifted his head fully. His glasses slid down the bridge of his nose as he studied the badge on the table. Then Camille Hart herself, standing calm and unshaken, as though this moment had been inevitable. "Repeat that," Harlow said, his voice slower now, stripped of the rote monotony it carried moments before. Camille stepped closer to the bench, her posture unflinching. She placed the slim black folder beside the badge, her fingers brushing it lightly as though sealing the weight of her words. "Special Agent Camille Hart, Federal Civil Rights Division, Department of Justice. I was undercover, investigating a series of unlawful arrests by members of the Hollow Creek Sheriff's Department. Last night was not an accident. It was documentation." The silence stretched until it felt unbearable. Even the hum of the old ceiling fan seemed to fade. Finally, Ellison barked out a sharp, nervous laugh. "This is a joke. Some city lawyer playing Fed to scare us." His words rang false even to himself, his voice cracking at the edges. Camille turned her gaze to him, calm and cutting. "Then perhaps you'd like to explain," she said softly, "why 6 black drivers were arrested within 10 miles of the same gas station in the past 3 months, why 3 dash cam recordings disappeared, and why 5 charges were mysteriously dropped after time served." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The facts landed harder than any shout could have. Nora Vega's pen raced across her notepad in the front row, her heart pounding. She had thought this might be a story worth lingering for, but this was more than a story. This was an earthquake. Judge Harlow leaned forward, his knuckles pressing against the bench. "Do you have proof of these allegations, Agent Hart?" Camille opened the folder, pulling out a flash drive sealed in a clear evidence bag. She held it up, the courtroom lights catching its metallic edge. Body cam footage, dash cam recordings, internal communications, all collected before the signal conveniently cut off last night. Your own records will confirm my access to the system yesterday morning. The words hit like hammer blows. Briggs shifted, his jaw tight, his face darkening with the realization that the game had changed. This wasn't a bluff. She had come prepared. "I request immediate release," Camille continued, her voice steady, each syllable deliberate. "Dismissal of all charges, and a motion to preserve every piece of evidence from last night's detention. Communications, footage, logs, reports, records, everything." The courtroom was no longer a place of smug certainty. It was a battlefield where the lines had been redrawn, and Camille stood at the center with her badge gleaming like a shield. Judge Harlow inhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing against him. He had worked alongside Briggs for years, had heard the whispers of misconduct, had chosen more than once to look away. But here, under the eye of a federal agent with evidence in hand, silence was no longer an option. He adjusted his glasses, glanced at the deputies shifting nervously in the back row, then nodded. "Motion granted," he said at last, his gavel tapping once. "Charges withdrawn. You are free, Agent Hart." The words cracked the air like lightning, but Camille didn't move. She didn't collect her badge or her folder. Instead, she stepped closer to the bench, her eyes fixed not on the judge, but on Sheriff Briggs. "I'd like the sheriff to approach the bench," she said. Briggs stiffened, his jaw flexing. For a long moment, he didn't move, his boots planted firmly against the scuffed floorboards. But under the weight of every eye in the room, under the truth she had just detonated, he rose slowly, walking forward with the heavy tread of a man moving toward his own judgment. "You've got nerve," he muttered under his breath as he reached the front. Camille's reply was quiet, almost gentle, but sharper than steel. "No, Sheriff, I have evidence." A murmur rippled through the room. Ellison looked down at his hands, his face pale, the memory of the night before flashing in his mind. The mocking laughter, the tug of the cuffs, the arrogance of assuming she was powerless. "You never asked for my documents before you cuffed me." The words replayed now with a weight he couldn't bear. Camille lifted her chin, addressing Briggs directly. 6 arrests, all black drivers, 1 missing dash cam recording, 5 charges dropped after jail time. You saw my skin, my car, and you thought you were safe. You laughed. But you never asked who I was. Now you'll answer for it." The sheriff's lip curled, but it wasn't quite a smile. It was the twitch of a man cornered, his power unraveling thread by thread. "This is federal overreach," he growled, loud enough for the room to hear. Camille stepped closer, her badge catching the light again. "No. This is federal accountability. And next time, Sheriff, I won't come with questions. I'll come with subpoenas." The words fell like thunder, shaking the room to its core. Judge Harlow sat back, his gavel still in hand but unmoving. For the first time in years, the law felt alive in that courtroom, not as paper, not as ritual, but as something living, something capable of piercing through the rot. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the courthouse windows as though the storm brewing in the sky mirrored the storm unleashed within. Nora Vega scribbled furiously, her pulse quickening. Every detail mattered now, every word. She knew she was witnessing the unraveling of a system that had hidden behind laughter and silence for far too long. The deputies in the back row no longer whispered. They sat stiff, their eyes darting between Briggs and Camille, their mockery drained, their certainty evaporating. The balance of power had shifted in the span of minutes, stolen from their grasp by the quiet strength of the woman they had tried to humiliate, and Camille Hart, standing calm and resolute, knew this was only the beginning. The badge had spoken. The evidence was undeniable. Hollow Creek's long silence was about to be broken forever. The air in the Hollow Creek courtroom was electric, charged like the atmosphere before lightning splits the sky. Camille Hart's badge still gleamed on the table, her folder of evidence resting beside it like a sealed verdict. She had requested her release, the dismissal of all charges, and the preservation of every scrap of evidence tied to her detention. She had spoken the words with clarity and precision, as though they had been rehearsed not once, but lived, carried in her spine since the moment the cuffs closed around her wrists the night before. Judge Martin Harlow, a man who for nearly 20 years had presided over cases without ever truly shaking the ground beneath him, now found himself staring into the abyss of accountability. His gavel, a tool he had wielded as ritual more than force, felt heavier in his hand. He cleared his throat, buying himself a second of thought, but the evidence was undeniable. "Motion granted," he said at last, his voice steadier than he felt. "All charges are hereby dismissed. Records, communications, footage, and evidence related to last night's events are to be preserved in full. Agent Hart, you are released from custody." The words landed with the weight of law, reverberating against the faded wood, echoing in the silence of deputies who had once laughed. A gavel strike followed, once, sharp, final. But the strike did not end the moment. If anything, it only opened the wound wider. Sheriff Clayton Briggs shifted in his seat, his thick hands gripping the brim of his hat until his knuckles whitened. For years, the courthouse had been his domain, a place where whispers and nods carried more power than truth, where a smirk could decide the fate of those who stood before him. Now, a stranger had turned the tide with nothing but silence, a badge, and proof. His face flushed red, his jaw tight, his body a storm barely contained. "This is my county," he growled, his voice rolling like gravel across the quiet room. The deputies behind him straightened, emboldened by his words but uncertain, their eyes flickering between the sheriff's defiance and the agent's calm. Camille didn't flinch. She didn't even look at the deputies. Her gaze remained locked on Briggs, steady, unwavering, like a spotlight that cut through smoke. When she spoke, her voice was soft, but carried farther than his bellow. "That's the problem, Sheriff," she replied. "It doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the people." The words sliced cleanly through the courtroom. They weren't loud, but they rang like a bell, echoing in the ears of everyone present. Nora Vega's pen froze mid-sentence, her breath catching as she scribbled the line into her notes. It would become tomorrow's headline. The phrase repeated on radios and screens far beyond Hollow Creek. Briggs leaned forward, his face inches from fury. "You don't know what you're starting," he snarled, his voice trembling not with fear, but with the panic of a man who felt his grip slipping. "You think one badge gives you the right to march in here and tear down everything we've built?" Camille took one step closer, her presence calm, deliberate. "No," she said, the badge on the table catching the morning light, casting a reflection like fire across the wood. "The law gives me that right. And the truth. What you've built isn't order, Sheriff. It's silence, fear, and it ends now." The deputies shifted again, unease spreading through their ranks. Ellison, sitting closest to Briggs, tried to hold on to his smirk, but failed. He could still hear her words from the night before. "You never asked for my documents before you cuffed me," now sharpened by the weight of her identity. The laughter he'd shared with the others in the gas station parking lot clung to him like a stain, growing heavier by the second. Judge Harlow tapped his gavel lightly against the bench, a nervous tick more than an order. "Sheriff Briggs, you will cooperate fully with Agent Hart's request. This court is adjourned." His voice was firmer now, though his eyes betrayed unease. He knew Briggs well enough to understand the sheriff was not a man who yielded easily. But under federal light, even the strongest shadows faltered. Briggs stood slowly, every motion deliberate, his boots striking the wooden floor with the rhythm of resistance. He placed his hat on his head, adjusting it like armor. "You and your people think you can waltz in here, flash a badge, and tell us how to run Hollow Creek," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "But this is my county. I built it. I protect it. And no outsider, no matter how polished, changes that." Camille turned toward him fully now, her expression unchanging, her eyes clear and unblinking. She let the silence stretch, let the weight of his words collapse under their own arrogance, before speaking once more. "Your county?" she repeated. "You've mistaken your position, Sheriff. This county belongs to its citizens, not to you, not to your badge, and certainly not to the fear you've tried to plant in its soil." The courtroom felt smaller now, tighter, as if the walls themselves leaned in to hear. Rain began to patter against the courthouse windows, a storm building outside as though the sky itself mirrored the reckoning inside. Nora Vega scribbled every word, her hand trembling with urgency. She knew history when she saw it. She knew when silence cracked, when truth carved its first mark. Briggs stepped closer, his shadow falling across Camille. But she didn't yield an inch. For every ounce of bluster in his voice, she met it with stillness, the kind that drew its strength from certainty. She was not there to argue. She was there to expose. "I've spent years keeping this county safe," Briggs spat, though his words sounded more like desperation now. "You've spent years keeping it quiet," Camille corrected softly. "But silence is not safety. And I won't let your silence stand any longer." For a moment, the room was frozen. Deputies caught between loyalty and doubt. A judge caught between routine and responsibility. A reporter caught between observation and history. And at the center of it, two figures, the sheriff clinging to a crumbling crown, and the agent tearing away its mask. Outside, thunder cracked. Inside, the gavel struck once more, sharp and final. Court was adjourned, but the battle had only begun. The storm that had begun inside the Hollow Creek courthouse did not end with Judge Harlow's gavel. It spilled out into the streets, into the headlines, into the whispered conversations at diners and gas pumps, where residents suddenly found themselves speaking about justice in a town that had long been silent. And within 3 days, the storm took form in the shape of black government SUVs, their tinted windows gliding down Main Street like a moving verdict. By 8 o'clock that morning, the courthouse parking lot was lined with federal vehicles. Agents in plain suits and dark windbreakers stepped out, clipboards in hand, radios clipped to their belts, their presence quiet but unmistakable. They did not shout or swagger. They did not need to. Their authority arrived in silence, the kind that carried more weight than any county badge ever had. Inside the sheriff's department, panic bloomed like a contagion. Deputies clustered in the dimly lit squad room, their voices sharp with fear. Computers hummed as screens flickered to life, and then quickly shut down again. Filing cabinets, once gathering dust in corners, were suddenly under siege. Papers rifled through by trembling hands, reports hastily rearranged, whispers of, "What do we hand over?" and "What do we hide?" bouncing like ricochets against the walls. Deputy Mark Ellison sat hunched at his desk, his hands pressed against his forehead. He had not slept properly since the courtroom, since Camille Hart's words pierced through his mockery and left him exposed to himself. "You saw my skin, my car, and you thought you were safe." The memory replayed in his head, louder than any order Briggs barked. He thought about the cuffs he'd locked around her wrists, the laugh that had escaped his mouth, the arrogance he'd worn like armor. Now the armor was gone, and all that was left was shame. Sheriff Clayton Briggs stormed through the squad room, his voice booming, his boots striking hard against the tile. "Nobody says a damn word without my approval," he barked. "This is federal overreach. They've got no right digging through our records like we're criminals." But even as he spoke, the sound of printers stopping, of files being copied, of hard drives unplugged echoed through the hallways. The agents were already inside. They moved with precision, seizing desktop towers, carrying boxes of reports, sealing evidence bags with crisp efficiency. For every word of defiance Briggs shouted, a subpoena answered it with silence, heavier, undeniable. Deputies exchanged uneasy glances. Briggs's bluster had always been enough before. A bark here, a growl there, the reminder that this was his county. But now, in the face of federal presence, his authority looked smaller, a shadow cast against a brighter, harsher light. One deputy whispered near the break room, "They're downloading everything, every body cam file, every dash cam report." Another muttered back, "Half of it's gone, deleted months ago. They'll see that too." The fear was palpable, thick in the air like humidity before rain. They weren't just worried about the files that existed, they were terrified of the ones that didn't, the gaps that told their own damning story. Briggs slammed a hand against a desk, startling the room into silence. "We'll stall them. Paperwork, protocols, whatever it takes. Make it look like bureaucracy. They'll get tired. They'll move on." His words carried force, but not conviction. Ellison looked up at him, eyes weary, voice quiet but sharp. "It's too late for that, Sheriff. They're already in the building." Briggs glared at him, but the truth in Ellison's tone left no room for rebuttal. Even Briggs could feel the walls closing in. He had built his authority on silence, on laughter that buried fear, on a county too small and too tired to push back. But silence cracked when faced with evidence, and fear turned its head when light came pouring in. By midday, the sheriff's office looked less like a fortress and more like a crime scene. Agents carried boxes of evidence out the front doors, their labels neat, their movements unhurried. Each box, each flash drive, each sealed envelope was another brick removed from the foundation Briggs had built. Reporters began to gather on the courthouse lawn, cameras aimed at the steps, microphones held ready. Nora Vega was among them, her trench coat pulled tighter against the wind, her notebook already filled with pages of names, dates, and quotes. She watched Camille Hart walk across the lot, her stride calm, her presence commanding without a word. No longer the accused, no longer the target of laughter, Camille was the storm itself now, moving through Hollow Creek with inevitability. Briggs finally stepped outside to face the cameras. His jaw was clenched, his eyes shadowed, his voice pitched low and steady as he forced out the performance of control. "My office has nothing to hide," he declared, his words crisp for the microphones. "We welcome this investigation. We have served Hollow Creek faithfully for decades, and that will not change." But the flicker in his eyes betrayed him. Behind the practiced words, there was something brittle, something desperate. He glanced just for a second, toward Camille Hart, standing at the edge of the crowd with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. And in that glance, the cameras caught it, the sheriff's defiance cracking under the weight of her silence. Inside, deputies whispered among themselves. Some asked whether they should look for lawyers. Others wondered if they should resign before the hammer fell. Ellison sat alone, his hands trembling, staring at the desk where he had once mocked defendants with casual cruelty. Now he saw his own reflection in every report being carried out, in every subpoena that arrived. He remembered the cuffs on Camille's wrists, the laughter that had seemed so harmless, and he felt the shame dig deeper, heavier, unavoidable. By evening, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across Hollow Creek. The courthouse, once the seat of unchecked authority, was now a hive of federal presence. The sheriff's department, once laughing and smug, was hollowed by fear and silence. And Camille Hart, standing steady as ever, knew this was only the first wave. The storm had not come to pass over Hollow Creek. It had come to stay, to dig, to expose. And no amount of bluster could turn it back. The storm that swept through Hollow Creek was no longer confined to the courthouse or the sheriff's department. Within 24 hours, it had spread to the airwaves, to the breakfast tables, to the hushed conversations in grocery store aisles. By the end of the week, the story no longer belonged only to Camille Hart or to Sheriff Briggs. It belonged to the people. The spark came in the form of black ink and headline type. Nora Vega's article hit the stands on Friday morning. The front page of the Hollow Creek Ledger carrying words that no one in town could ignore. Federal agent exposes racial profiling in Hollow Creek. The letters leapt from the page, bold, undeniable, stripping away years of rumor and whisper. Underneath the headline, Nora's writing cut with surgical precision, names, dates, case numbers, and the chilling pattern that Camille's evidence had laid bare. 6 arrests, all within 10 miles of the same gas station. All black drivers. 3 missing dash cam files. 5 charges dropped after short sentences served, all without explanation. The article described in detail the very night Camille was pulled over. 5 miles over the limit, cuffed before a question was asked, mocked and booked like a criminal. It carried the quotes from the courtroom, her words printed in black and white for every reader to see. That's the problem, Sheriff. It belongs to the people. By noon, the town was buzzing. People at the diner on Main Street argued over coffee mugs, their voices heated. One man slammed the paper on the counter, pointing to the list of missing footage. This ain't just a mistake. This is a pattern. They've been doing this for years. Another muttered, I told you Briggs and his boys were out of control. At the post office, a retired teacher clutched the article in trembling hands, shaking her head. I taught some of these boys, she whispered. I never thought I'd see their names in here like this. At the barber shop, where voices usually rose in easy laughter, the conversation was heavy, somber. Targeting black drivers, one customer said quietly, his voice tinged with both anger and resignation. We've been saying it. Nobody wanted to listen until now. Phones rang relentlessly in the mayor's office. By 2 in the afternoon, the receptionist could barely keep up with the calls flooding in. Some demanded resignations. Others demanded answers. A few demanded justice in louder, angrier tones. The mayor himself, a cautious man who had long kept his head down in county politics, sat pale-faced at his desk, the newspaper open in front of him, the phone buzzing non-stop. He had avoided confronting Briggs for years, preferring silence to conflict. But now silence was no longer an option. On social media, Nora's article spread like wildfire. Her words, carried beyond the county lines, were picked up by regional outlets. The headline was shared and reshared, the courtroom quotes clipped and posted, Camille's badge and voice becoming symbols far larger than Hollow Creek itself. Federal accountability, trended by midnight, the phrase repeated alongside snapshots of Briggs outside the courthouse, his eyes darting nervously toward Camille. Inside the sheriff's department, the panic turned into fracture. Deputies avoided eye contact, their once boisterous laughter replaced by tense silence. Ellison sat alone in the break room, the paper folded in front of him. His name wasn't in the article, yet, but the evidence was clear enough that his memory filled in the blanks. He read and reread the line about 6 arrests, his mind replaying the night at the gas station. His own laughter echoed in his ears, louder than ever, each chuckle now a dagger. Briggs stormed through the halls, waving the newspaper like a weapon. "Lies," he barked. "Twisted stories, half-truths. We've kept this county safe, and this is the thanks we get?" But his deputies' eyes betrayed doubt. They had seen the files being carried out. They had heard the silence of missing recordings. They had watched Camille Hart stand in that courtroom with evidence in her hands. And deep down, they knew the paper wasn't lying. By evening, the courthouse lawn was filled not with agents or deputies, but with citizens. Some held signs. Others simply stood, their presence a question Briggs could no longer dismiss. One woman shouted, "We want the truth!" Another added, "No more silence!" Their voices rose in waves, echoing off the courthouse bricks, rising into the night. Nora Vega stood at the edge of the crowd, notebook in hand, her heart racing as she watched her words turn into movement. She had written stories before, small-town disputes, council meetings, the occasional scandal, but never had she seen her work ignite a reckoning. She scribbled notes as chants grew louder, as the crowd swelled, as citizens who had once kept their heads down now lifted them high. Camille Hart watched from a distance, her figure steady under the courthouse lights. She had not come for glory, had not come for fame, but seeing the crowd, she understood the deeper current. This was never only about her arrest. It was about years of silence cracking open, about a town forced to look at the truth it had long tried to bury. Sheriff Briggs finally emerged onto the courthouse steps, his face tight, his voice sharp as he faced the crowd. "My office has nothing to hide," he repeated, echoing the same words he had spoken to the cameras days earlier. "We have served Hollow Creek faithfully, and we welcome this investigation." But the crowd didn't buy it. Murmurs of disbelief rippled through them. A man shouted, "Then where are the tapes?" A woman called out, "Why all black drivers?" Briggs's jaw clenched, his hands gripping the podium until his knuckles turned white. His words sounded weaker now, drowned out by the voices rising against him. The storm was no longer at the edges of Hollow Creek. It was here, in the town square, in the voices of its citizens, in the ringing phones of the mayor's office, in the printed pages of Nora Vega's article passed from hand to hand, and in the center of it all stood Camille Hart, calm as ever, her silence now transformed into something larger, a movement, a reckoning that could not be laughed away, ignored, or silenced. The storm that had broken Hollow Creek did not fade with the night. It lingered in the air, in the conversations at every diner booth and porch swing, in the pages of the ledger stacked on countertops. The courthouse square, once a quiet gathering place for parades and small-town ceremonies, had become the center of something far larger, an echo chamber of accountability. And within a week, the reverberations that started with one arrest had shaken the foundations of power. Sheriff Clayton Briggs resigned under pressure 7 days after Nora Vega's article ran. The announcement didn't come in the form of a proud statement, but, as a leaked letter, typed in stiff lines, his signature jagged at the bottom. By the time he faced the cameras, the resignation had already spread across the state. Standing on the courthouse steps, Briggs tried to twist his exit into sacrifice, stepping aside for the good of Hollow Creek. But his eyes betrayed the truth. The fight had left him. His empire, built on silence and intimidation, had collapsed under the weight of exposure. Deputy Mark Ellison didn't wait for the cameras. He cleaned out his locker in the gray light of dawn, moving slowly, his head bent. The weight of shame hung heavier than his badge. He stuffed his uniform into a duffel, avoiding the glances of other deputies who gave him wide berth. When he left the building, he didn't look back. There was no farewell, no speech, only the sound of his boots on pavement and the quiet slam of his car door. His resignation wasn't printed in headlines, but it was final all the same. He had mocked silence. Now, silence was all he carried with him. But Hollow Creek's reckoning did not end with its sheriff or his deputy. Federal investigators, bolstered by Camille Hart's evidence, widened their scope. Within 2 weeks, subpoenas reached neighboring counties, files were seized, and names whispered in small towns across the state began appearing in official reports. What had been tolerated as routine, traffic stops that escalated, footage that vanished, charges stacked without reason, was now exposed as systemic. Each case pulled another thread, unraveling a tapestry of abuse that stretched farther than anyone had dared admit. The people of Hollow Creek, once resigned to silence, found their voices. Citizens who had never set foot inside council meetings now stood at microphones demanding reform. The mayor's office overflowed with letters, phone calls, petitions. On Sundays, church pulpits carried not only sermons, but calls for accountability. The courthouse square became a place of gathering again, not for parades, but for rallies, candlelight vigils, and speeches that reminded Hollow Creek that law was meant to protect, not to control. Through it all, Camille Hart remained a steady presence. She did not grandstand. She did not seek headlines. She moved quietly, methodically, with the same calm authority she had carried the night she folded her clothes in the holding cell. Where Briggs had barked and Ellison had smirked, Camille simply worked, reviewing files, attending hearings, meeting with federal teams. She was not there to bask in victory. She was there to ensure that the storm she had unleashed left something lasting behind. One morning, just before sunrise, the town square lay bathed in a soft amber glow. The air was still damp from a night of rain, the brick sidewalks slick, the courthouse steps shining under the first light. Camille stood at the edge of the square, her hands folded lightly in front of her, watching as the sun climbed slowly over the rooftops. The storm had passed, but its mark remained, in the headlines, in the empty sheriff's office, in the voices that no longer whispered but spoke openly, loudly, without fear. Nora Vega approached quietly, her notebook tucked under her arm. She had been following Camille for weeks, documenting not only the events, but the shifts in the air. The way Hollow Creek itself seemed to breathe differently now. She stopped beside Camille, her gaze lifting toward the glowing horizon. "Agent Hart," Nora said softly, her voice carrying the reverence of someone speaking not just to a source, but to history itself. "Off the record, what happens now?" Camille did not answer immediately. She let the silence stretch. The same kind of silence that had unnerved deputies and unsettled judges. A silence that demanded thought rather than reaction. Finally, she turned, her eyes steady, her voice low but resonant. "Justice isn't a storm that passes," she said. "It's the work left standing after the rain." The words hung in the air, weighty, immovable. Nora scribbled them down, knowing they would outlast the moment, knowing they would echo far beyond Hollow Creek. As the sun rose higher, the square filled with early risers, shopkeepers opening their stores, a pastor unlocking the church, children pedaling bicycles through puddles. Life resumed, but it was not the same life as before. The town had been altered, reshaped, its silence broken, its people awake. For the first time in years, the courthouse did not belong to a sheriff. It belonged to the people, and Camille Hart, standing quietly at the edge of the square, knew that was the legacy worth leaving. The story of Hollow Creek is not just about one sheriff, one deputy, or one courtroom revelation. It is a mirror held up to America itself, showing us how silence, when left unchallenged, becomes the soil in which injustice takes root. Camille Hart's journey reminds us that accountability is not born in a single day, nor is justice a storm that sweeps clean and disappears. It is the daily, deliberate work left standing after the rain. For American citizens, the lesson is clear. We cannot afford to look away when patterns of abuse appear. 6 arrests in 3 months, 3 missing recordings, 5 charges dropped without reason. These are not coincidences. They are warnings. They are the signs of institutions that believe they answer only to themselves. And yet, as Hollow Creek showed us, even the most entrenched power can be broken when truth is exposed and the people claim what has always been theirs. The county was never the sheriff's. The badge was never a shield for abuse. Authority was never meant to belong to one man, but to the people, to you, to your neighbors, to every citizen who believes that fairness is not optional but essential. The responsibility lies with all of us. If you see silence, ask questions. If you see fear, speak truth. If you see injustice, remember that justice bends only when we bend with it. And remember, too, that accountability doesn't begin with the storm. It begins with the courage to face it. Camille Hart did not shout, did not flinch, did not beg. She showed us that silence, when wielded with strength, can dismantle the loudest arrogance. Now the question is, what will we do with that lesson? Will we fold our hands and wait? Or will we rise and carry the work forward? Friends, if this story moved you, if it reminded you that justice belongs to the people and not to those who mock it, then stand with us. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next story. Like this video to push it higher where more eyes can see. Share it with your family, your friends, your community. Because justice is not a storm that passes, it is the work we carry together every single day.